The year was 258 AD. For those who are rather well versed in their world history, you will know that this was a time of turmoil, especially for the Catholic Church as it existed in the Roman Empire. Because the Emperor Valerian at the time had ordered the widespread persecution of all Christians and was working to take out some of the higher members of the hierarchy and to ultimately punish them and put them to death. Pope Sixtus and his companions were amongst those that were targeted, and Pope Sixtus did indeed suffer martyrdom for the faith underneath Valerian. But he wasn't done. And in fact, the prefect at the time was looking amongst all of his companions, and he found one in particular who was of importance, and he set his sight on him. That this was a deacon that was by the name of Lawrence. And the reason for his intrigue with this particular man was that this particular deacon and man was in charge of the church's temporal goods. All of her vessels, all of the silver, all of the gold, the things that seemed most important to the prefect. And so he brought Lawrence in. And he told him that he wanted all of the church's wealth and all of the things that would count as riches in this world brought before him. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, after all. And Lawrence was a rather wise man, and he thought about it, and he asked the prefect for 3 days to gather things up and put affairs in order. And the prefect gave him that. But what Lawrence did during those days was altogether different. Because Lawrence, while he gathered the church's wealth, he did not amass them to give them to the prefect, but instead started to distribute them to the poor, the widowed, the orphaned, all of those that would be in need and would be best served by the church. He gave all of the temporal riches to the church's actual riches. And then on the third day, whenever the time came for him to appear before the prefect, what did Lawrence bring? Did he bring with him all sorts of treasures, all sorts of gold and silver and vessels? He did not. But what he did bring was what makes the church truly rich. The widows, the orphans, the elderly, the sick, the infirm, all of those that were amongst any of the sheep of the flock of the church, those, in Lawrence's estimation, were the church's riches. And that was what he brought before the prefect that day. The prefect was not a man of good humor. And in fact, he was very much angered and humiliated by what Lawrence had done. And so he ordered that he be executed in one of the most terrible ways he could imagine, by being slowly roasted on a gridiron. And so Lawrence went forward and suffered this torment for quite some time. But one of the very last things that we know of Lawrence, and perhaps one of the things that sets him apart from the other saints, is that while he died, the tradition is that he was not in a state where he was completely devoid of humor. But instead, he was actually able to joke with one of the guards, telling him, "I'm well done on this side. It's time to turn me over." Even in a moment of suffering and affliction, some of the worst we could imagine, Lawrence still had the character and the virtue to be able to be joyful. In this beautiful saint that we celebrate today, which is our namesake and the patron saint of this parish, we find so much exemplified for us to consider and even virtues to pray for. But I dare say, my brothers and sisters, we should consider 3 different virtues from St. Lawrence today that could help us along the way. 3 things that we can not only try to work on ourselves, but also ask St. Lawrence for, so that we too may live this life well as he did. So what is the first? The first virtue that we can see that Lawrence would have exemplified would be the virtue of fidelity, of faithfulness. And we see this especially playing out whenever the persecution was widespread. Because Lawrence, he could have went into hiding, or he could have kind of put his duties off to the side. He could have excused himself and said, "It is all too much." Simply did something else. But he did not. And even whenever Pope Sixtus, the very figurehead of the church at that time, was put to death, that did not make Lawrence waver. But he had faith to continue to press on. And we are in no different times, my brothers and sisters. Even though it does not seem like we are under active threat of persecution or even martyrdom, we still need the virtue of fidelity, because we live in a world that challenges our faith, that wants us to give up on virtue, that ultimately wants us to put aside Catholic value and instead replace it with self-centeredness. That is not what the virtue of fidelity does. The virtue of fidelity sees that at the end of the day, every day, we should be pursuing the kingdom of God through the happy moments, through the easy moments, through the sad moments and the difficult ones. We need the virtue of fidelity through all of them so that we never shirk our duties as Christian disciples, and we never falter, we never fail. That's what St. Lawrence did. He continued and was faithful. And then we continue on, we notice that whenever it came to the amassing of the church's temporal goods, what was the first thing that Lawrence saw fit to do? He was aware of the needs within the church at that time, and so he gave them all of these things. That does not mean that the church has to do this today in the same way, but it means that everything that the church has belongs to the faithful, that everything we see belongs to all of us. And he wanted to make sure that even in the time of persecution, that the widowed, the orphan, the elderly, all of those that would have been the outcast of society, that they were well cared for. And so he gave them all of these things to make sure that they were cared for. But that wasn't the most generous thing he could have done. The most generous thing he could have done was, even in the face of martyrdom, was to give an example by the outpouring of his blood and by giving up his own life so that others might live and see the example. And that was truly the way that Lawrence was most generous, was by giving his example of giving up his life for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He was aware of the words from the gospel that unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single grain with no life. He did fall to the ground and he did die, and he produced much fruit. He was truly being generous to the people that needed encouragement and needed to see how to stand courageously in the face of so great an evil. He was generous. So should we be. And then the final virtue that we see in the very last moments of his life. It's a virtue that is rather uncommon these days, but it is one worth pursuing. Long-suffering. That Lawrence, even in the moments whenever he was suffering the most, whenever he was undergoing the agony of his martyrdom, what did he do? Did he turn and start to scoff and to spurn those that were persecuting him? No. He responded with a joke, with charity, and with love. That even in this worst affliction that we could imagine, he was able to suffer this thing, and he was able to come out and pass that test with flying colors. And my brothers and sisters, all too often we get so angry about the minor annoyances and inconveniences of life, let alone martyrdom. Perhaps we could take something from St. Lawrence today as he exemplifies that virtue of long-suffering. May we too receive the grace to be able to bear patiently the wrongs that are done us, and the evils, the afflictions, the pains, the grief, the trials. May we receive God's grace so as to have that virtue of long-suffering, to be able to endure whatever this life on earth throws at us, so that we may enjoy the life of the beatified and even life alongside St. Lawrence in the next. St. Lawrence exemplified virtue so well. May each of us, my brothers and sisters, through his inspiration and his example, may we truly live out the virtues of fidelity, of generosity, and even of long-suffering.